nutrition per acre. And we need to put a cost on ecosystem services, everything that we take for granted in nature that take care of us. And what if we could harvest in space? And what if we could, I know that they think they found water on Mars. And what if we could augment nature? And so I'm really thrilled to have the speakers that we're going to listen to today here. Johan, will you introduce the speakers?
I will.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. We have who are doing this event here today. I think it's really cool. When I look out in the audience, I see all the people here, because I know most of you. It's like, God, this is some funky level on the audience here today. So make sure that you connect with each other and with our speakers, who are Sian, Proctor, and Masatoshi, Funabashi. We'll start with Sian. Sian is a fantastic, amazing person. If you look at her CV, you kind of wonder what type of superwoman is this. You know, astronaut, finalist, you know, doctor, education outreach officer at the Mars Dome that the NASA built in Hawaii, cookbook author, what else, I don't know. And she has the funkiest suit I've ever seen, of course, like with a bunch of NASA patches on it. I just love that. But I won't take away the joy, you know, by telling about Sian. She will do that herself. And then we have Masatoshi Funabashi over there, that I think is also one of my favorite scientists, talking about how can we make ourselves a plan or build ourselves a plan that is sustainable for us by totally rethinking how we farm things. And that's not only necessary here in Sweden, it's more necessary when you take into account all those billions of people in the tropics that are currently supplying 70 to 80% of the food we're actually eating. And who cannot live off their land, but commit suicide at a rampant rate because they're being forced to produce stuff that they don't want to grow because an industrial food system forces them to. But we need to change that and build a world that's healthy and sustainable with many, many different varieties of herbs and greens that we eat every day. But Sian, let's start with you. Please come up on stage and join me here. A big hand for Sian. Take it away.
And so when we're thinking about food and space, NASA and other space agencies have been thinking about this for a long time. NASA's been thinking about food in space ever since Kennedy put the charge for us to go to the moon. And so if we're going to send people into space, how are we going to feed them, keep them healthy, happy, and provide them with nutrition? So one of the things when we look at the early food systems, the first way that they fed astronauts was actually using a tube of, well, it looks like toothpaste. And you got to eat your meal from here. Doesn't that look great? Beef and vegetables from the tube. But we've come a long way with space food. And so now NASA and astronauts, are eating a lot more like this. It's pre-packaged meals or snacks. Mainly it's things that you just add water and heat to. And so also tortillas are a big hit in space. But it's just food that the astronauts feel comfortable with. They can mix and match it together just a little bit. But for the most part, it's already mixed meals. And so when we're talking about space and space exploration, some of the key things that NASA is concerned about is food preservation. How do you keep food stable in space for a long time, especially if you're going to do long duration space flight to Mars? Going to Mars, we're looking at a 3-year trip, basically. And so how do you provide enough food that is going to be stable for that amount of time? Health and nutrition is a big thing with space, and menu fatigue. And the reason why is when astronauts go up into space, their physiology changes. When you're not on gravity, you don't have gravity anymore, what happens is your face and your body changes, it swells up. And so food that you're used to eating when you're at home doesn't taste the same in space. And so when an astronaut picks up their menu for space, they think, okay, this is going to be great. But then they go up there and they start eating it, it's not quite the same. And so they suffer from menu fatigue. They don't want to eat as much as they need to eat. And they start losing weight. And then that's a problem for an astronaut in space. And then there's the culture of food. We have a real rich history of food in our culture and how we have our meals. And one of the interesting things is in space, do you need a kitchen table to eat at? Not really, because you're floating around, but the astronauts insisted on having some kind of tables so it felt more like home, the culture that's around food. And so as NASA's thinking about long duration space flight, putting up habitats on the moon and Mars, they're really concerned about what to do with food. And that's why they funded the NASA High Seas missions. So the NASA High Seas missions is an analog site located on the big island of Hawaii, on the slopes of Mauna Loa. This is the High Seas Hab. It is a dome that's just under 1,000 square feet. And what this is used for is to put a crew in, a crew of 6 generally, and they live in this habitat anywhere from 4 months to a year. And they're acting as if they're living on Mars for that amount of time. And so what does that mean? It means that if we go outside, sorry, gotta stop hitting the clicker. It means that if we go outside, we have to wear a spacesuit. And so you can see that this is why this is an analog site, is because it's very Mars-like. There is no vegetation anywhere here. It's volcanic in nature. And so when we went out and did EVAs, it felt like we were on a terrestrial planet. But we could not go outside unless we were wearing a spacesuit. And so the dome itself is not sealed. It's not like Biosphere 2, which is in Tucson, Arizona. Biosphere 2, if you're familiar with that, was a sealed ecosystem where they tried to live for a long time and to survive and thrive basically within that confined space. Instead, the dome here is not sealed, and we were allowed to go inside and out if we wore a spacesuit. Now, one of the things was we did a lot of research in the high seas habitat. We had research from NASA for exercise, working with Canadian Space Agency rovers, doing microbiology research. All of these kinds of things were happening while we were living in the simulation. But for me, the main point of this NASA-funded simulation was food strategies for long-duration spaceflight. So this was my crew. We were the first crew to ever live in this NASA hab. So we were the test subjects for this experiment. And so we had a really nice international crew. Our commander, Angelo, is Belgian. And then I was the Science Education Outreach Officer. Jahaira is from Puerto Rico, and she was our chief scientist. Oleg grew up in Russia until he was 12, and then he moved to the United States, and he was our geologist. Kate Green was our science communication writer, and so she has a master's in physics, but turned into a science writer. And she's from the United States, and so me, Jahaira, the 4 of us here are from the United States, and then our engineer is Simon, and he's from Canada. And so this gives you an idea of what the high seas habitat looked like. And again, we were the very first crew NASA funded, and our mission was food strategies for long duration spaceflight. The kitchen was the primary focus of our simulation. And this is all the food that we were beginning to unpack when we first moved in. And so when we're talking about the research, what NASA was interested in is if you have astronauts basically eating pre-prepared meals, so something like this, just add water and heat, everything is coming from a container, what bang for your buck will you get if you have astronauts creatively cook using freeze-dried fruits, meats, and vegetables and other shelf-stable ingredients? And so what we did is we spent 2 days eating just pre-prepared meals, and then we had 2 days of creatively cooking, and that lasted for 4 months. So I lived in that simulation for 4 months, 2 days eating pre-prepared meals, 2 days creatively cooking, and we alternated every other couple of days for the entire 4 months. And so again, what was interesting was the creative cooking aspect using shelf-stable ingredients. And so these are freeze-dried ingredients here, but we had a lot of spices we could choose from. We had freeze-dried fruits. We also had canned things. So NASA considered anything that lasted 3 years or longer to be shelf-stable, and that could be in our space pantry. So the target was 3 years or longer. And this is Jahira and our commander Angelo creatively cooking in the kitchen. Now, I was the education outreach officer, so for me, one of the things was how do we get people excited about this new Mars analog site on the Big Island of Hawaii that nobody had ever heard of. And so what I decided to do is run a cooking contest called Meals for Mars, where people from around the world could submit recipes before we went into the simulation using our space pantry, and then I ran a cooking show with my other analog astronauts, and I cooked all of these different meals that were submitted from people around the world, and that's my Meals for Mars cookbook that I have. What I was surprised about was the creativity of the people who submitted recipes using our space pantry. And so there was a variety of different things, from spam musubi, which Hawaii, if you've been to Hawaii, spam is culturally something, a big part of the culture, to soups and stews, to campfire hashes, and even snacks and desserts. And so we had a wide variety of creativity that was brought into the habitat using shelf-stable ingredients. Some of the big takeaways that I experienced while in the simulation was the appreciation of the food, the variety of food that we were able to make, and the appreciation you get when you're cooking for others in your crew. And so what would happen is we would cook in groups of 2, and it was really interesting to see the different meals that people came up with. Oleg, with his Russian background, boy, he was a fantastic cook. Whereas a lot of astronauts might not like to cook. And so Simon, he wasn't as much into cooking. He was very simple with his meals. Whereas Jahira, again, very creative, using a lot of the spices and the things from her culture, along with Oleg. And so for NASA, and I think one of the big takeaways is the culture of food and what it means to be able to sit around the table and eat a meal that was created by your colleagues, for you, and the appreciation you get for that, instead of just adding water and heating a meal. There's something about that. And not only that, being able to creatively cook with different crew members. You know, the bonding that happens during that time was also really important. So how does this have anything to do with food on Earth? Well, I'm a geoscientist by training. So I teach at a community college in Phoenix, Arizona. I teach physical geology, geologic disasters. I teach some planetary science, but I also teach sustainable cities and sustainable world. So when I got out of the Mars simulation and we had all of this experience with food, I started thinking about sustainability and how what I learned in space applies to Earth. And so a friend of mine once said that if we solve for space, we solve for Earth. And what we mean by that is that when you think about survival in space, it's all about efficiency for food, water, energy, and shelter. All the things that we need to survive in space are the things that we need to thrive here on Earth. And so the more efficient that we can be with how we are with that space technology for food, water, energy, and shelter, we can bring that technology back here on Earth and use that so that we can become more efficient. Fruits and vegetables anymore. Instead, I'm buying freeze-dried, which is shelf-stable to up to 10 years. And I can put that in my pantry now instead of using my frozen blueberries that I used to. And so when we're talking about freeze-dried fruits, meats, and vegetables, what we're talking about is taking up to 98% of the water out of the fruits, meats, and vegetables, and then that becomes shelf-stable, again, for up to 10 years. So what does that mean when it comes to cooking? Well, what you have to do is you rehydrate it. And when you rehydrate it, then it becomes available for you to be able to creatively cook with it. Now, a lot of you are familiar with freeze-dried food, but you don't realize it. Freeze-dried fruits, how many of you like cereal that you can buy that has fruit in it? Most of your cereal these days, the fruit in it is freeze-dried. And that's what you're having in your cereal in the morning. Now, don't get me wrong. When I'm thinking about these freeze-dried technologies, I don't want us all just eating freeze-dried food. What I think is a sustainable way for us to potentially go forward is a combination of freeze-dried fruits, meats, and vegetables with local grown, fresh fruits, meats, and vegetables. And so for me, what I was thinking about when I came out of Mars simulation is the fact that I would go to the grocery store and fresh. What does fresh mean to us culturally? If the food is coming from halfway around the world, how fresh is that? What does that mean in terms of transportation costs and sustainability versus locally grown foods that we can have, whether it's our own urban garden or urban gardening systems or locally or regionally grown food? So what I was thinking is that when we think about shipping food around the world, we should think about putting it into a freeze-dried, shelf-stable system, and then combine that with fresh fruits, meats, and vegetables from our local region. What would that look like for our world if we started to do these kinds of things, combining these two things, instead of it all being fresh from around the world? In the United States, it's already happening. You can get freeze-dried fruits and herbs in your local grocery store. So when I go shopping now, I'm actually seeing more and more freeze-dried things from around the world coming in to the grocery store. At home, this is my pantry. So at home we have our garden, me and my husband, that we get. We also have local, urban gardens and co-ops in our neighborhood. And then this is my pantry. This is the freeze-dried food that I have. Now, freeze-dried fruits, meats, and vegetables, I can't get the stuff now, the meats, in the supermarket, but I can get them by ordering them online. And so in the United States, we have a big prepper community. Do you guys know what preppers are? Yes, doomsday people, right? So between that and also the Mormon community, the Mormon community out of Utah, they're very big on having a year's supply of food that is available in case something goes wrong. And so you can buy this type of food in the United States very easily. And what's also interesting is how many of you guys have heard about, or have bought those subscription online foods like Blue Apron, where you get fresh food that's mailed to your house now? Well, one of the interesting things about that is that you get these packages with all this fresh food in it, but in our busy lives, can you imagine how many people don't get to that before it goes bad? They'll put it in their refrigerator, but then they're like, oh, it's a week later, and they're like, I didn't get to this in time. Well, they're starting to ship those same kinds of things in shelf-stable form. So these are just like those Blue Apron subscriptions. You can get simple plates that have everything that you need to make a meal, but it's shelf-stable. So this can be sitting on our shelf for 5 years, and then I can be like, oh, I'm hungry, and I'm going to go and grab that and make it. So when we're thinking about these things, we can think about, for instance, when a disaster happens and food. When people need food and they don't have electricity, well, if they have water and we can provide them with this type of food, then they can be able to eat and sustain themselves and not have that issue. So some of my takeaways are, we ship water around the world in the form of food. What does that mean? In Phoenix and desert regions, we actually have foreign companies that are coming in and buying up swaths of the desert. Instead of using the water in their area that's arid, they're harvesting water from our region, and they're shipping it back to their country in the form of food. When we're talking about food spoilage and wastage, most of your microbial waste and stuff comes from the fact that there's water in food. You take the water out, that allows it to become stable for a much longer period. Transportation costs, refrigerators around the world, refrigerators in supermarkets, the cost of shipping food, all of that is wrapped into this. And so the other thing is when we talk about jobs in the economy, could we potentially create more jobs if we create freeze-dried factories in rural agricultural areas, take the water out, leave it at the source, and then ship it worldwide? What would that look like? What would that mean? Thank you. They want fresh. What we're talking about is, well, when you want to make a soup or stew, freeze-dried foods are foods that are already cooked and then freeze-dried. And so what you can do then is you can take that and you can creatively cook things that you wouldn't expect to be, I guess you would say, grilled right away, or that you would eat rawly. Like sushi, you're not going to have as freeze-dried. But we did make, and we actually did make sushi while we were in a habitat, using shelf-stable ingredients. So it wasn't fresh meats or fresh fish. It was canned. But the point being is that it's a cultural thing too. And so when I would go and reach for my frozen blueberries out of the freezer to make my smoothie, or I would go and get a bag of frozen green beans from the freezer, it's those kinds of things that we can replace with a shelf-stable variety and not necessarily need the big freezers and refrigerators as a result of that.
Isn't this a horribly expensive technology?
It is expensive, but the more we invest in it, the more the cost will come down. But you got to think about the collective cost of how much it costs to ship fresh foods around the world, refrigerate them in big warehouses and stuff around the world, freezers in every supermarket around the world, freezers in every household around the world, collectively energy-wise. So what can we do culturally to collectively shift our mindset from, having the big house with the big refrigerator and freezer to more sustainable pantry?
Any questions from the audience? Yeah.
You were talking about the nutrition. You were talking about the nutrition and that you take away the water and the nutrition stay. Does everything stay? Is it comparable to a fresh vegetable?
Yes, for the most part, with the technology where it is now, yes, it is very comparable to the nutrition that you have when you take that water out. And so again, there's the fact that you're taking your meat and you're cooking it anyways. When we're talking about the nutritional value, we're talking cooked to cooked. We're not talking necessarily fresh to not. Because there's nothing's going to replace the crisp freshness of like biting into broccoli or lettuce. Because what we're talking about is this is stuff that's already been cooked and then is freeze-dried. So it's more of, better to do a comparison of frozen to frozen. Frozen to freeze-dried, nutrition value-wise. And so yes, you're not losing the nutrition, as much of the nutrition as you would dehydrating it. But there is, because you're cooking it, there is a loss from fresh to freeze-dried.
So even berries like you have in your breakfast cereal, they're cooked before?
No, those aren't. I'm talking about your meats and your vegetables tend to be.
Okay, so if you compare a berry that you would have in the
then yes, it's negligible. Based on the research, there is no significant difference between them.
Question over here. You just stand up and yell. Like that.
I work with hydroponics, and I tend to see a lot of people that are skeptical towards like new kinds of food technology. So with dehydrated foods, do you see that, and like trying to get people here in their everyday lives to eat more dehydrated instead of, what do you do about that?
I think again, it's getting into the culture of food and what does that mean for sustainability and us as a species on this planet. And so a lot of it is getting into food psychology and culture and dealing with that from an early age. And so one of the things that I love over here is that we have some of the insect food, and that is a big thing for space. And so culturally, where you grow up, that has an impact. And so there are cultures obviously around the world that have no problem with this. But in the United States, people are like, oh, there's that hesitation. And what I think is that it's time and exposure that makes the difference in the long run. And so, again, in the United States, I'm seeing more freeze-dried technology being introduced. It's first coming out of the cereals, then it's going into the snacks, and again, it's part of the culture of the Mormon community, and as that spreads, then I think that you get that critical mass where it flips over.
Question.
I heard that in space, generally the canning has been replaced by the retort pouches. Can you hear me or?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, the retort pouches are now used instead of the traditional aluminum cans.
Yeah, so you're talking about the ones where you can just add, they're pouches that you can hydrate.
So so I'm asking, does the freeze drying also like incorporate any change in the packaging? Because we know that packaging could be a big waste problem.
It absolutely is a big waste problem.
But does freeze drying technology anyway look to the fact that the packaging doesn't involve any, like, so that the packaging is simple and...
Yeah, and that's one of the things is that when you're thinking about how you can keep that stuff, and again, shelf-stable, you can go to packaging that is, recyclable, or cans that are recyclable, and things like that. And ideally, you'd be moving away from plastic wrapping of all of the foods and stuff like that. But again, it becomes shelf-stable. You have a dehydration pack inside these. But they're tin cans about this big. You open it up, and your meat is going to be stable in there for a long time, as long as it doesn't get wet.
So what is the cost of like one of those simple plate thing if you would buy it?
Okay, so a simple plate for this, which feeds, I think, anywhere from 2 people generally is the size, but I find that the portion size is a little bit bigger than that. I think the cost is $10 each, and it serves 10 to 15 depending on what the item is. And then the tin cans themselves, this costs, I want to say, around $15 a can. And me and my husband, I mean, we'll have a can for 3 or 4 meals it will get us through. So
basically, technology-wise, if you have a big enough consumer base, it's okay, right?
Yeah.
So that's not sort of out of the...
No, it's not out of the realm.
You just need a lot of Mormons in your country.
Just drill that. That's very good. This is a religious game, right? So Martin, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, this all comes with that you have access to water, right?
It does. So water's a big one, yes.
Otherwise you have to bring the water and then it doesn't
right.
lose the whole point.
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And so there is a water component that's there. And so water is another huge issue that worldwide that needs to be tackled for us to be more sustainable. But again, it's that when we're talking about space, they're going to look at taking water from the moon, regions of the moon, or on Mars. And so not being able to ship that water over there. We're going to have to figure that out. But here on Earth, when we're talking about places, especially when we think about disaster preparedness and when a disaster comes in, and like Puerto Rico is an excellent example of that. And so how do we get water access access first, because that water, not having water is going to kill you faster than not having food. But solve the water issue and then bring in the food and be able to hydrate that food, and then the energy comes afterwards to get back on board.
Okay, lovely. Let's close the question time for now. We'll bring you back up on stage again later on, Sian. And you're also having a masterclass later on. We're actually going to cook with some freeze-dried food.
Yeah,
right?
I brought some samples, so if you want to, you taste some of this stuff.
It's
What
going to
did
be
you like?
really fun. I'm going to be an assistant too, so I really want to participate.
Thank you.
A big hand for Sian Proctor.
To Tunisia and Egypt and Italy and France, all these countries compared to your country, it's quite chaotic. So since the arrival to Ireland airport, I was much in the comfort. Those difficult people. That's the people I need to talk about the space age, because I'm sure that in the spaceship communication would be quite difficult. Okay, so I'm basically working on this planet, Earth. But as I proceed in the scientific component of my study on sustainable food production, I had some generalization that could be applied for the space age as well. And there's actually many aspects in my research. But for today, I want to focus on this topic, which is not agriculture, but the terraformation. So the reason why I say terraformation and not agriculture, you will see at the end of the presentation. So here is some picture from space taken by NASA. On the upper part, it's China. And you can see that some particle from Gobi Desert going down to south, which is affecting actually our sky in Japan. But we don't really feel it. But if you look at the Google, you cannot see that either. But it's quite obvious from the satellite image that this kind of desertification is happening in massive scale. And the cause of that, the major cause is the inappropriate practice of agriculture in small scale. People are talking much on heavy industry, but today, if you look at the loss of biodiversity, that's agriculture, which is the major driver. And this is another satellite image, but with spectral analysis. So it's not like the Earth as we see through our eyes, but just through the sensors. The red part are actually the sediment that is going out of the agriculture field, in this case in Australia, in a huge complex delta of a river, and which also affect the marine ecosystem. And today there's lots of coastal zone that run out of oxygen because of this sediment, which is also impairing the marine life that we don't directly see with our eyes. What we see as a direct image is things like that. Wow, logging. Most of the logging is done for the conversion of land into agricultural land, and which accounts for the 25% of global emission greenhouse gases. And take all that together, what is scientifically anticipated as a major crisis is what we call the sixth massive extinction of the Earth's life, or the global regime shift. So it's like a global version of desertification. What was used to be a blue planet in 1950s, 60s would not be anymore in 2045, when our global population will reach 9 billion people. And there was certainly a collapse of the ecological state. I mean, that huge loss of biodiversity, which are irreversible. We cannot recover naturally, because it's like destroying the brick. Once the brick is stuck, it is solid, it is resistant, robust. But when it's fallen apart, you cannot simply go back to one step before and reestablish. You have to take a long way around to restart the ecosystem itself. So that's something called the global state shift. And the greatest challenge for me in this 21st century is how to prevent, how to cope with this problem. And the problem seems to me too big to handle for me as an individual, a small person living here. But there's actually media bias that I recognized while looking at the United Nations report, what is reported is not necessarily the negative impact of large-scale monoculture as we see on the media. It is true that these are also problematic and impairing the biodiversity, but it accounts for only 20 to 30% of the global food production. For the rest, 70 to 80% are owned by the smallholders, family scale, less than 2 hectares or something equivalent, which account for the 80% of food production, and which are, of course, the major driver of negative impact locally, but that which accumulates in a global scale that is driving mass extinction. So looking at this, I thought if we need to really change smallholders, maybe I can also do something, because if I can create a small model that fits the smallholder that can be replicated in other places of the world, because there's massive amount of people. Maybe I play on the principle of open source and share my experience and try to see with the same principle but different tailoring of different ecosystems to produce food everywhere in the world. So this is what I studied, and I say conceptualized as ecological farming, short culture project. I explain about the name later. But to tackle this, the problem of loss of biodiversity. So to mainstream biodiversity, I introduced the huge diversity of edible crop species, about 200 species or more in 1,000 square meters. So it's kind of the diversity never realized in natural history, but which is for the first time possible by human assistance, especially through smallholder agriculture. And what I observed is that there's a beautiful organization of ecological niches that made us possible to get out of this practice of monoculture methods, so the tillage and fertilizer and phytosanitary product, the chemicals and pesticide. And we try not to use these 3 major methodology and still producing a lot of food. But of course there's a huge complexity, so this is something that we had to handle. But above all, this project is based on the scientific formalization. As you can see, I don't have much experience as a farmer. I was initially a veterinary medical scientist. I did molecular biology, and then I did PhD in physics in France, so I was not a farmer. But I knew that there's a principle called Ecology, also known as community ecology, which began at the beginning of 21st century by a Swiss botanist, which showed today's development mainly by American ecologists in the 1960s in Florida. And it treats the relationship between the biodiversity, different levels between genes and individuals and ecosystems. And also in relation with how the ecosystem is functioning and forming the resilience and forming the way of material cycles that are self-sustained and that are resilient, that by itself recreates that diversity. So you can see natural ecosystem with sufficient conditions such as temperature, sunlight, rainfall, they never run out of that diversity, and we do not yet why, but this is something that partially explains their self-organizing mechanism. So based on this theoretical framework, this was the result that we obtained from the experimental field. It's quite complex to explain, but it's a kind of asynchronous harvest. So you pick the plant that became grow well than the other plant, but you don't know which will come first and which come later. And you also continuously add other crop species if there's a gap. So it's a kind of desynchronous harvest, and it's driving local agricultural cooperative people crazy, because usually you have to set the standard and to measure how much we can produce for a single product and try to be as reproducible as possible each year. Now, I totally ignored that. So I said, for the first month, we have this kind of 10 products that we could obtain harvest. But next month, we don't know. But still, we could do some another 10 products. And so we saw that everywhere by sending, by packing that into a box, or just to provide as a meal, as a salad in the restaurant, and which amounted to 2 to 4 times more productivity than the conventional farming, if I compare with the national statistics. So this is the actual image of our harvest. There's a lot of plants that I didn't even know the name, but which was actually very good. A lot of fruits, vegetables, herbs, medicinal herbs. And I also, of course, invented a lot of recipes out of this harvest. I love cooking as well. But everything was really good. I also added some natural product like the varmint, the GP white boar that we captured on the field. And we tried to combine what the meal that represents our ecosystems. Everything was really good. But the only problem is that it can only happen once. So you have to be right there to enjoy the meal. The second time I cannot recreate, but I believe it's a real creation. Okay, so as you see, there's a huge diversity in the field, which also support a huge diversity in nutrition. And scientifically speaking, there's a lot of study between the biodiversity and the diversity of nutrition. And in short, we have to sustain biological diversity to sustain our health in terms of nutritional profile. And I wanted to dig more deeper into this aspect. So I used this product from our field of sinicoculture, which is a green tea, which is largely consumed all everywhere in the world. It's one of the greatest green product in Asia. But cultivated in a very different way. So actually we took the monoculture field of tea that was abandoned for like 5-6 years, so there's completely clean, no more chemicals or fertilizer. And we just removed the half of the tea trees and introduced about 50 edible species like vegetables and fruit trees and tried to make a mixture in the sinicoculture way. Actually, food is doing is to working on every part to do the fine tuning of the whole. And it's not by a single track that we want to attenuate the problematic part, not by a single molecular product that could enhance the health. It's the whole bottom-up process. And to totally measure the effect of this difference that is provided from our field in contrast to the field, this conventional method that is just next to our field. We also performed the kind of clinical trial and using more than 100 patients in rehabilitation center. We measured what is called functional independence measures. So the rehabilitation center is somewhere where we do the training of rehabilitation for many elderly people who have physical difficulty in daily life, such as just standing up or going to bathroom or just talk with people. There's a lot of elderly population in Japan, and these people have, it's not handicapped people, but it shows the decrease of the physical and cognitive performance. So the rehabilitation is trying to catch up with a series of training, to which we produced our tea product, offer the tea product, and performed a double-blind test. So each patient was randomly chosen whether or not to take our sinicoculture tea, or just a conventional tea, or just water. And the result was really significant, that there's a really highly selective effect from the sinicoculture tea that we cannot really break down in a single component, because the level of caffeine and catechins are fairly the same between sinicoculture tea and conventional tea. But still, that we think that it's a kind of comprehensive effect on the whole phytochemicals that are overexpressed in the sinicoculture tea. There's a real significant effect. And this result was too good to be true, so the medical doctor didn't like it, because normally the rehabilitation process is how to stop the degradation, and they can never recover in the common cells. But what it's showing in this figure that just by taking the single culture T and doing the rehabilitation training worked very good, and even improved their performance if measured with FI measures. And actually there are a lot of other people who are reactivated and, you know, we can look like 5-10 years younger or so. Okay. So, if you know this picture, this is a Japanese astronaut who is eating his first Japanese space food in ISS, and he's drinking green tea. And it's just a pity that we haven't yet brought Snapple culture tea in ISS, but I propose, I'm trying to propose, and I'm even talking to JAXA that we absolutely introduce Snapple culture tea in space, because it's for sure that it will enhance the physical and cognitive capability for the space mission of astronauts. Anyway, I come back to this planet Earth. And the next step that I challenged is how to cope with the really hard problem in this planet, which is the desertification. So for that purpose, I went to Burkina Faso, one of the sub-Saharan countries, which is on the verge of desertification. So this is actually a picture I took from the car. You can see it's in transition from steppe to desert. And there I collaborated with an NGO called Afidra and tried to install a small silviculture garden of 500 square meters by associating about 150 edible species that we found on site, the traditional ones and also the commercialized product, and also other from traditional knowledge. We made a list, and we also went to find the seed on site from the local ecosystem. And the result was really significant. It's that only 1 year of silviculture recovered from this kind of desertified land into left rich edible forest is 150 edible crops. It's just 1 year. And normally, if you leave the site without doing nothing, it doesn't change, because there's a rainy and dry season. And it's sure rainy season they have a lot of rainfall, but during dry season there's not. So the local vegetation, if there's even spontaneous regeneration, they will all die out in dry season, which maintain the desertified formation. But with silviculture, we can augment the organic material and biodiversity on site, and once maintained by human, it's quite consistent. It can systematically increase their biodiversity. So this is after 1 year of installation. So you can see there's a huge papaya growing without any fertilizer, no chemicals, because after all they don't have money to buy all of this input. And after 2 years, they are still continuing the harvest. And 3 years, it's during rainy season, so we have a lot of biomass. But even during the dry season, we still have a lot of biomass, because we are also pouring water manually. And also, the vegetation is quite dense and mixed. They actually retain water and prevent from evaporation. So we use water, but it is used in the efficient cycle of the formation of the soil. So this is a summary of the result. We had access to local market. Well, accessibility is another problem, but I will explain that maybe in the afternoon session. Our productivity was really high for local people, so it amounted for about 1,000 euros per month constantly from 500 square meters maintained by a single person working 20 hours by week, which accounts for 20 times the gross national income per capita of Burkina Faso. So you can imagine that you do the silviculture garden of 500 square meters in your backyard, and you earn like 20 times more than the mean salary there. Also, in terms of social problems such as poverty, it is quite high impact, because it is 50 times the absolute monetary poverty threshold. So it's kind of the minimum wage that we need to live, a single adult person to live in a capital city, in this case, Ouagadougou. So if I take the average of our result, only 10 square meters, so this is just like this, a volume that only 10 square meters can, in average, produce the minimum wage for a person to live in Ouagadougou. And if we compare with the national statistics provided from the Burkina Faso National Statistical Institute, when I think in French, it's always the word is in a different order. It's 40 to 150 times more, but just compare the sales. And if we can efficiently propagate this practice, given that we have market accessibility and we have the mode of transportation, probably including the freeze-dried food, only if we can convert only 1% of the entire population of Burkina Faso into the producer of Sian, we may fairly say that the entire population will be lifted above the poverty threshold. So it's quite highly concentrated, efficient production. So with all this result, we held 4 African symposia, 3 in Burkina Faso, and last month in Tunisia. And we published a lot of things, including our data and scientific articles, and also connected with local authorities. And one of the really remarkable impact that we had, and also on which I was extremely honored, is the contribution to the drafting process of the new constitution in Burkina Faso. It's written in French because this is the original text. And actually they are trying to renew the constitution, and in which we just brought our report and scientific results to the National Assembly to defend the argument on how to put the article concerning the right to access to sustainable agriculture. So that is something new, because usually in the constitution we have right of human rights, right? For the human to survive, we need basic right. And if you know, in some of the indigenous constitution, they also have the right of mother nature, so that the nature itself, the intact non-human nature, can hold also the right to survive, just like human should survive. And what is stated in this article is something that goes beyond this conflict, because normal human rights and the right of nature can fall into conflict if we have demographic pressure and if the natural resource is limited. So they interfere between each other. But here, the accessibility to sustainable agriculture is something that the government assure and control the protection, conservation, and even the augmentation of the environment, especially the biodiversity, through the sustainable practice of agriculture. How to recreate the biodiversity out of the agriculture practice itself. And that is something that defines the new constitution of Burkina Faso. We are also working on so-called sub-regional decree in ECOWAS countries. In these countries, we are trying to set up the academic curriculum of silviculture, and the decree that justifies the introduction of the silviculture method in all schools, elementary school, junior and senior high schools. And we also studied the collaboration with the UNCCD Convention to Combat Desertification, which already has this project of the Great Green Wall in sub-Saharan countries initiatives. And it is the plan to create the largest living construction ever in human history. This kind of green wall that transfers from west to east of Saharan region, about 8,000 kilometers, on which we try to introduce in each village our silviculture farm. So looking at this all result, what we see is what we see as desert slate. And what has changed the climate is, for one thing, there's astronomical reason. That's the orbital axis of this planet had stood up upright in a way perpendicular to the rotation around the sun. So the north part of Africa got more exposure of sunlight, and surely it will produce a drier climate, but it was not sufficient to explain the emergence of Sahara Desert. It is actually our ancestors, we human, has burned out all this part of ecosystems with animals, with livestock, so that to feed the livestock, we want the ecosystems. And they let the livestock to feed on the regeneration process. So this is something that triggered the local regime shifting and produced the Sahara Desert about 8,000 to 4,000 years ago. So which still means if we can go back to this process and use the human force in a reversal way, we still have a possibility to convert this part into, at least into productive forest. And this brings us to the insight in a more astronomical level that the framework of conservation and mitigation that we are talking today, especially in the United Nations Conference and other environmental initiatives, is not sufficient because it remains all the way within this framework between the preservation and desertification. So they are basically talking about the degradation and how can we lessen degradation in compromise between human activity and intact nature preservation. And this is quite symbolic, but if in scientific way talk about the evolution of biosphere in this life, it's about the complexification, the emergence of biodiversity out of the inhabitable condition, such as we see on the planet Mars. But in the past, in this planet, there's no life. But somehow they managed to have the physical and chemical condition that can have a life, which shows the complexification of today's biosphere. And agriculture is going exactly in the opposite direction, on which any kind of sustainable development is discussed. And instead, what I want to introduce is the possibility of augmentation that is exactly going in the same direction with the terraformation. So it is no more a conflict between human and nature. It is a symbiosis, an augmentation, a mutual beneficial cycle that because we human exist, we can create a kind of new ecosystem in the new era of Anthropocene that we human and other living organisms can mutually survive. And for that purpose, I'm also developing the information communication technology from the Solid Laboratory, but it's just for the excuse to get the budget. So, human augmentation, this is something that I try to establish and defend. And recently I have the Nature article on the ocean. So finally, if I talk about the Spaceport, what we have generally is this kind of high-tech picture. We go in single food, efficiently, highly efficiently, in broad cycle, with water conservation, with nutritional profile, and so forth. But what we would really need in the long-term spatial mission is like, this one, in my garden. This is also the application of snake-culture in the middle of Tokyo, which introduced more than 1,000 commercial cultivars in about 250 square meters. So it looks obsolete, but it's filled with the very fancy and delicious things that I'm cooking, and it's quite delicious. This is the left is summertime, and right in the wintertime, if you can notice, there's some fraction of snow. It's quite robust, resilient, adaptive, and something that supports, not in terms of nutrition, but spiritually our daily life. Okay, to finish, I'm also a mathematician, so I want to put it in a very rigorous way. What we need, what we should consider as necessary and sufficient condition for the sustainability in space age is, first of all, to solve the problems on Earth. If we cannot solve our problems, there's no way that we can escape to Mars. And technologically speaking, it's not possible. But which in turn, logically speaking, say, if we can immigrate to Mars in a quite successful way and thrive there, including everything necessary to hold to success our generation there, we can also automatically say it is a sufficient condition to resolve the major problems on Mars. So it's up to you to which side you work, but we are actually working for the same problem. And I appreciate your kind attention.
So, remember where you heard it first. Because I think this is kind of revolutionary. When you talk about something that can improve land productivity with 40 to 150 times, we have solved it. You know, we solved the problem. You solved the problem. Thank you very much for that.
It's my African colleague.
Okay, well, in any case, then what is between us and solving that problem? Isn't that one of the next problems we need to solve then is to how to go from this industrial food system that forces farmers to grow certain things because they fit into an industrial system, instead of building from the ground up and realizing what we can use the ground for and how we can feed people off that ground. Would actually not just make people healthier because we'll have more nutrition. The whole planet can be a blue zone in a sense, right? But it also means that the farmers finally get paid for what they're good at, which is mainly growing stuff in a good way. Right. So you people at the Farmers Association, you should really connect, because I would love to see the farmers living a better life, both in Sweden, but also, as you rightly point out, around the equator, where most people live and most food is grown. Any questions? Carolina?
What about access to water? How much do you need in order? It looks very arid. But
It depends on the region. Actually, in Japan, we do not put water except the beginning of the germination. And when the plants are really small, we add some water. But after that, we leave the natural way to grow them out. And in Africa, we have access to a well. So we do the irrigation with spray, much like other monoculture method. And in terms of the quantity of water, we use more water than the monoculture method. But the efficiency of product, in terms of quantity, yes. But the water that are maintained on the topsoil, actually, we have much more productivity for that. So if we compare the water efficiency, our methodology was almost the only one who could pay the cost of water. That's one way.
Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you for a great lecture, and it's really inspiring and interesting to hear how this could help solving the issues with food production and people to have something to live on in development countries or in countries with a lot of desert and things like that. But have you started looking at how we can do this in on an efficient scale, not because it takes a lot of manpower, right? It's like harvesting, like doing this in a bigger scale. Otherwise, many of us have to turn into farmers in order to do this in a big scale. Or do you see this as a solution for some parts of the world, but not for to replace the big scale industries of farming? Or
if I talk on the Japanese situation, actually it requires less labor cost. So usually in conventional organic farming, we do the small scale farming in Japan for the vegetables, and it requires a lot of more labor than the sneakoculture field. That's one thing.
How come? Why?
Because they have to maintain the field by putting a lot of inputs to till the land and put the fertilizer, and there's a long period that we do not have any harvest at all, but only investing for the input to the field. And also the way of working, it's just a simple thing. If you have monoculture field, and if you have eggplant here, you can just harvest here, but not there. But in sneakoculture, you are surrounded by a lot of harvest food. So you can just harvest by just hanging around. That's it for today. If it's not sufficient, you can. But of course, the modality of harvest is quite different, but it's quite light and manageable by even for elderly population. And there's actually a lot of dimension that goes into the management. For example, how we cope with the vermin or some white borer and some deers coming into your field and eat up everything. And in monoculture field, it's quite easy to divest it because you see only the single crop. Once it's gone, it's gone. But in sneakoculture, sometimes we leave all these animals and even alien species to eat something, some part of our product, but we actually don't care because we have a lot of other things that remain intact. So this is like the stock market. I suppose you are not putting all your money to buy the stock of Sony alone. If so, I recommend you to rethink about it. But when it comes to agriculture, people really goes easily and quickly into this direction. And for one thing, they don't have the information how we can diversify the culture. And also, they do not necessarily have the market access for the whole diversity of the product. So if we can overcome these two things, for small-scale farming and for vegetables and foods, I think it's very achievable to replace. And for the large scale, well, it's also the question how we rescale our civilization. Is this good to have only a small portion of population watching? It's in the middle of desert. It was actually a meter press. I don't know if I can talk about it. But they imported the American system called Pivot. So it's a long tube that irrigates the land by turning around like this. So it takes like 14 hours, 20 minutes just to make one round, which irrigates the field of monoculture. And there the problem is that the land is quite hard, and if you plant only a single plant, it doesn't develop sufficiently the root system, so the water cannot penetrate actually. So one of the ideas is to create a biodiversity spot inside of the culture and try to drain the water from this hole into the part which will eventually support by water cycle the whole monoculture system. But this is not a sneakoculture itself, but this is one of the applications of the same principle. So there might be some combined system of sneakoculture and large-scale monoculture system, which maybe in the long term give more performance or also sustaining the biodiversity.
Question there.
You might have noticed that Sweden is a bit colder than Burkina Faso, especially today. But in this country or in Nordic countries in general, lots of production is taking place in greenhouses. My question is, have you considered applying agricultural principles to soil-based greenhouse food production?
Actually, this is, thank you for the very good question. This is something I have in my mind now. We are starting a sneakoculture pilot farm in northern part of Japan, which is in terms of climate quite equivalent to Budapest and Stockholm and so on. So continental climate with cold winter. We have to see. Probably there will be some season that we cannot really produce, but just keep the vegetation as it is under some half underground greenhouse, but not completely covered because we need intervention of the insects and other animals. In Japan, in the south, we have usually between February and March, there's a season that we do not produce because it's too cold. But in sneakoculture experiment, we could still maintain our densely mixed polyculture system out of which we did the harvest, even during this season. So it is true that we can extend the active season of agriculture. We don't know yet what is the northern limit of that. So this is the ongoing challenge. And so also another way is to combine with the stock breeding system, because I see Sweden didn't live totally on agriculture. It's you have the long tradition of stock breeding, including reindeer, that I really like it. And so maybe we can have the combined system and create a natural organic material cycle within the field, which follow the principle of ecoculture, and not only producing vegetables and fruits during the warmer season, we can also work on the stock breeding during the winter. That's one of the combined solutions, and I consider that as a possibility.
I think this is, so this is one of the questions we're going to discuss in the master class a little later today, because we have two master classes, Sian first cooking upstairs, and then Masa coming here and doing more of a master class. We're going to discuss exactly this question. By the way, if you would like to participate, I know if there are any tickets left, but talk to Federico over there, Joanna, who's here somewhere, yes, over there. Okay, any more questions?
Generally, there is genetic modifications to combat the climatic conditions that kind of affect the plant growth. So does this culture will help in reducing the genetic modification that happens, or does it include that in this culture?
Okay. For the GMO, ecoculture does not use GMO. And it's GMO-free practice. And it is not because I consider it as dangerous or, well, I think it's problematic, but for the safety issue as a scientist, I don't have conclusion on that because there are a lot of contradicting evidences, and it's a matter of who funded the research, actually. And my point of view is that the GMO is not sufficient to solve the planet, to solve the problem of this planet. Neither it is necessary to introduce, because what we want to solve is the loss of biodiversity, which supports the great water cycle on this planet, which is also related to climate change. And to do that, you have to look what the nature has been doing in evolutionary scale. What kind of diversity has created the topsoil that sustains this water cycle biodiversity? Surely astronomical number of genetic diversity is playing their role. And it's not only the matter of active genes working now, it's the matter of the total reservoir of genes that had quick response each time there's some disturbance. So you have to maintain this diversity. And if I look at the GMO, the only thing we can do is to manipulate about 10 or at most 20 genes for a single crop. I think it's not sufficient. If you really want to be a serious GMO scientist to save the planet, you have to treat astronomical number of genes. And I propose to do that on Mars.
No, but I think it's a quite, shortly, I think it's interesting because you talk about the topsoil here.
Yeah.
The fun thing about this is, with the traditional way of farming, industrial ways, we're just, diminishing the topsoil. We're plucking it out with the produce, right? But here it's actually plucking it out and you're regenerating at the same time.
Yes.
I think it's kind of fun. So when you showed me a picture once, digging in your plot in Tokyo, which basically looked like the parking lot before you started cultivating it, suddenly it's like, a thick layer of very, very good soil.
Yeah, it's like our clothes. You shouldn't be naked. If you put off your clothes, you have to put on another one. So pretty much the same thing for the topsoil. And yeah, that's what pioneer plants have been doing, for example.
Cool.
Yeah. I'm super happy to hear your presentation. I run 4 different farms here in Sweden. One is about 5,000 square meters, and the 3 others are about 100 square meters. And we do it in urban areas, and it's very similar to your culture, actually. So I'm happy to actually have some scientific research behind it. I'm curious about the social aspects, because since we work in urban areas, that's a big component for us. And you mentioned the poverty question in Burkina Faso, but have you also done it in urban areas, and have you kind of had that social aspect into the system?
Okay. For the field that I monitored, it's based on partly the professional farms and also some service I managed myself. And for the things I managed, I didn't sell the product. I just did by myself and invited my friends, but not to put in the distribution chain. And for the professional farms, including Burkina Faso, they already had a good value chain. So they knew already that if you produce in this way, we can sell the product, which is not always the case with ordinary farmers. So that's one thing that I wanted to discuss in the afternoon's workshop, how we can create a various business model or value chain that can integrate this social aspect. And I can say what I know for the moment is that going through the third party, like the supermarket chain or agricultural cooperation, it's not very promising because they always want to set the standard and they take the margin out of it, and they want to control by reducing information. Why? What consumers really want is not the reduction of information. They want health, they want good food, they want traceability, for example. So with this respect, we really have to play on the diversity, which is not possible by just going through the third party. So we need to conceptualize the direct matching between diverse consumers and diverse producers, which in turn, a producer may be a consumer in a given time and vice versa. So we call that peer-to-peer networking process, which is actually coming with the emergence of new internet technology, but we are not actually realizing in real society, but it's in just laboratory experiment or in simulation. But that's a kind of new organization that we may introduce in the next society.
Okay. Thank you very much, Masa. A big hand again. It has been amazing to have the two of you here, and it's even more amazing that you will stay on for a bit longer and go into the master classes, cooking with Sian upstairs in the restaurant, and after that, a little later in the afternoon, Masa, together with a bunch of you here, will discuss how can we implement this in urban areas, in northern areas, business models around it, etc., etc., for the benefit of the future, sustainability and health. Thank you for coming, and thank you to Ugly Smoothies over there, and thank you to Carolina and Madeleine, Anna, and everyone from Axe Foundation who we did this together with. A big round of applause for them.